hate speech bill has now become the Hate Speech Act, when Sara went on a flurry of signing acts into law and hoping that this would benefit at the election. And it seems to have landed like a damp squib. But there's an aspect of it that I would like to particularly discuss, and that is the potential for lawfare surrounding the Hate Speech Act and trying to criminalize hate speech in general. And for this, I have my fabulous guest on who will be familiar to many of you, and that is one advocate, Mark Oppenheimer. Mark, welcome to Free Speech Matters and High FM.
Thanks for having me.
Mark, can you just give very briefly an idea of what the particular difficulty is with the Act in respect to criminalizing hate speech? Is it a good or bad thing? And some of the unexpected consequences of who may in fact be the beneficiaries of being able to use this Act and who will be the victims of using this Act?
Yes, so up until now, the way that we've regulated hate speech is through the Equality Act, which has no criminal sanctions in it. So you can be made to apologize, you could be interdicted from further speech, you could be made to make a donation to an organization that combats racial hatred. And it had been constitutionally tested in the Kwalani matter in which I appeared. And there, what the court did was to deviate from Section 16(2)(c) of our Constitution on the basis that you could justify a limitation of the right to free speech by adding in more protected groups. So the Constitution only speaks about race, gender, ethnicity, and religion. And so sexual orientation was the one in that case that mattered. But there are about 17 grounds in the Equality Act that were included. And then also harmful speech is a category that was recognized by the court as opposed to merely incitement to harm. But hurtful speech is out. So there must be some distinction between those things. What the Hate Speech Act does then is try and mirror the language of the Equality Act while introducing criminal sanctions. So you can be jailed for up to 5 years. Now, in principle, one might think that the Constitution allows for some speech to be met with a criminal sanction. But only in that narrow case that it's advocacy of hatred on race, gender, ethnicity, or religion, and that constitutes an incitement to cause harm. So once we move beyond that, we're intruding on a free speech right, and you have to justify it in terms of the limitations analysis. The limitations analysis specifically refers to, are there any alternative means to achieve this end? And obviously there is one. It's the Equality Act. One thing that should also be alarming is that the way that our courts have generally dealt with hate speech cases is arbitrary, to be charitable. In other words, they could be flipping a coin when you sort of look at the outcomes that are there, or they have picked a certain kind of side, which is that if you are in a favored group, then you are free to speak. If you are in a disfavored group, then people can say whatever they like about you. So if you think about the different kinds of judgments that have come out recently, there's someone who was made to pay a fine of R500,000 for using racial slurs against black people. And then you have Julius Malema standing in a stadium of 90,000 people, being one of the world's most well-known politicians, calling for the slaughter of white people. And that speech is viewed as merely political speech that is to be protected. And so you have a strange situation where courts have tended to go after nobodies, at least sanction nobodies, while providing a lot of room for politicians, while also recognizing that there's supposed to be heightened scrutiny over those with enormous amounts of power. So a further concern is that the Hate Speech Act specifically builds in discretion from the prosecuting authority. So it could be that what happens is that two people say things that count as hate speech, and the prosecuting authority says, well, we're going to go after the one but not after the other. So it may very well be used as a weapon of terror against those who hold unpopular views or are part of marginalized groups.
Now, what happens in the event, and this is probably a little tricky with respect to criminal matters, where you have to prove the guilt of a person beyond reasonable doubt. what are the consequences if you actually are found guilty of criminal hate speech in a court? What can the consequences be for you?
Well, it says up to 5 years in jail. So a judge could exercise discretion to not jail you. But there are, let's say, sentencing guidelines that come about through the common law. So, for example, if we think about Vicky Momberg, who was jailed for using racial slurs against the police officer, that was then later used as a precedent to jail someone else who had merely been accused of using racial slurs and had denied it, and there was no video evidence like there was in the Momberg case. So what might happen is that over time you wind up with your own set of facts that sort of say, well, the speech is this bad, or at the moment it might just be that it depends on what that magistrate had for breakfast, or which newspapers they read, or what other personal biases they have.
Now, haven't we sort of seen this lawfare even take place within the context of the Equality Act? In other words, under civil legislation, not yet criminal, and that was the case of poor old Penny Sparrow, who was really very much as somebody described her, your middle-aged white lady sitting in a towel, of no particular consequence, with no particular influence, and she said a racially derogatory, although rather paternalistic and patronizing rather than really hateful, by referring to black people on the beach as monkeys, give you an example. And she thought she was communicating purely on Facebook or some other form of social media with friends, and beginning, December holidays came and she was just vilified and literally pulled through whatever processes were available, Human Rights Commission, Equality Court, Magistrates Court, and was hit with everything, including a suspended jail sentence, not including a fine, a donation of which had to go to the ANC's charity of choice, because the ANC was essentially was the complainant in the matter. The police, the state, both prosecuted her, and the Equality Court dealt with her in terms of the Equality Act. So everything was literally thrown at her within a 9-month period. So it included criminal injuria, which is a common law criminal remedy, and she neither had the money, she didn't have the money for a proper defense. She had none of those things that you would need to go up against an entity like the ANC.
Yes, so there's very good reason to believe that the Sparrow case was done basically as a dead cat strategy. So it comes at a time when Jacob Zuma was under enormous pressure for having fired the finance minister. So Sparrow is prosecuted at the sort of beginning of 2016, but you had huge rallies saying Zuma must fall towards the end of 2015. And then suddenly the news cycle changed to this little old lady in the middle of nowhere that no one ever heard about anymore. So bizarre. Also, the standard that was used to hold Sparrow liable was hurtful speech. And that is no longer the standard. It remains to be seen whether if someone did what Sparrow did, whether they would be held liable on the new standard. So it's possible that the presiding officer says, well, hurtful speech is out, and someone like that would have been held liable for hurtful speech. I'm just going to say it's harmful speech, and not give any reasons for why it falls into that category. So there is that danger. And as you say, I mean, Sparrow ultimately winds up dead. So this is someone who kind of gets hounded to her death from being in the newspapers all the time, from being put through this legal chucker. Of course, if you are Julius Malema, then you have legions of resources available to you, and also it may be of assistance that you sit on the Judicial Services Commission and could determine the future of judges.
That's probably the best example of the hugely powerful on the one hand and the hugely powerless on the other, if you can be hugely powerless, was poor old Vicky. Sorry, I'm mixing my Mombergs and my Sparrows, but my poor old Penny Sparrow. But I wanted to ask a question, or give an example of the wisdom of using, or otherwise, of using hate speech in the criminal sense. Perhaps let me couch it like this. You've got the situation where the political elite support are pro-Palestinian, and to some extent, in some cases, pro-Hamas. There's been quite a lot of protest and outrage expressed on social media that the Jewish community, or parts of the Jewish community, might consider harmful, or would like to see it charged and as harmful. Is there a risk that you might get the sort of judge that leans towards the more powerful grouping, in this case, the accused groups or the accused persons, and to get away from hate speech is actually to have recourse to other common law remedies? It could be damage to property, it could be assault, it may even be a murder or culpable homicide, but that a range of what is available under existing common law, rather than actually tying it to hate speech law.
Yes. So, for example, if you think about some of the actions taken by students at Columbia, they were engaged in unlawful trespass. They were engaged in the destruction of property. So, you would have remedies against those students, regardless of what it is that they were saying, because they were engaged in other kinds of illegal conduct. The interesting speech cases, I suppose, are when you're using symbols. So, for example, in the old South African flag case, the Supreme Court of Appeal held that the use of the flag could amount to hate speech in certain circumstances. And it's quite clear in the Hate Speech Act that you don't need to utter speech, as in words. Symbols would count. So there's a question as to whether, let's say, people who are pro-Hamas, who wave a Hamas flag, could be opening themselves up to prosecution under the Hate Speech Act. And then there's a separate question as to whether, if it does amount to hate speech, whether they would actually be punished. Because as you mentioned, there are personal biases that might play. Now, Hamas are recognized as a terror organization in most of the Western world, by the EU, by Australia, by America. We don't recognize them as a terror group. And one might say that South Africa has played a special role in propping up Hamas by going to the International Court of Justice and laying claims of genocide against Israel. Now, it is, of course, possible that a different kind of case comes out. And it's one that I warned of when I ran the old flag case, which is that that case creates a precedent that some people are going to view some flags as offensive. They might even view some flags as other kinds of apartheid flags. So as soon as the original judgment came out, there was a call from the EFF to say the next move is to declare the Israeli flag as an apartheid flag and have it banned because it amounts to hate speech. You can imagine a move like that being made now. And in terms of a tactical question, who lays the first charge? If one is laid, would the other one follow as a tit for tat? We remain to see.
Probably almost to go back to the beginning is what are the, other than the sort of the penalties that you could face if you're charged with hate speech criminally, what are the sort of broader, sort of more perhaps fundamental reasons why you shouldn't be criminalizing hate speech, or should be very reluctant to go the criminal route as opposed to the civil route or any other process?
Yes. So I take the view that there are certain kinds of speech that you want to make unlawful. So, for example, if I call someone up and say, I want you to put a bullet in my wife's head, okay, I think that that speech act is an act of attempted murder and should be punished with a criminal sentence. I think if you're standing in front of a mob and jeering them on to kill the one foreigner in their midst, that you are, even if the foreigner isn't killed, you are placing their life at risk. And we do punish certain kinds of behavior that doesn't result in a harm but is risky. So, for example, if you're drunk driving and speeding at 180 kilometers an hour down the highway, but you don't hit anybody, we still think that you've committed a crime and that you ought to be punished for it. But we should be very narrow in how we apply that, because free speech matters. So one of the reasons why free speech matters is that it provides a steam valve for people to express their views, which we might find despicable, but fall short of posing a risk of harm to others. And the advantage is that instead of acting out through real violence, they're able to say what they want, and then that simmers the tensions down. It also gives us a temperature gauge, which is very useful. So I've said on a number of occasions that displays of the swastika in South Africa are not illegal, and you almost never see it. And if it was illegal, we wouldn't know how big the appetite was for neo-Nazism. The fact that it's permissible to do it in law, but it never happens, shows us where the temperature gauge is. Once we start to see that rise, and we have seen a huge rise in anti-Semitic speech recently after October 7th, well, then we need to start thinking, well, what can we do to combat the hatred? And some of it is going to be through education, some of it's going to be through counter-dialogue. There's a famous case of Nsebu Dlamini, who was the head of the SRC at Wits, who described himself as a friend of Hitler. And the view was to say, well, maybe he just doesn't know what he's saying. So he was taken to the Holocaust and Genocide Center, was given some sense of an understanding of what Hitler actually did. And that appears to have changed his mind, in that he wrote a public apology, and hasn't said anything that I'm aware of, and that was anti-Semitic since then.
Well, this is exactly the thing about free speech, whether one's an absolutist or you put conditions on it, is the fact that not only it's a foundational right to many of the other rights that we enjoy in a democratic society, but also it is you can't battle something you don't know about. And the one problem I see with something like criminalizing hate speech is that the possible consequences, Penny Sparrow style, would make people self-censor. And so in effect, the act and those who are keen and able to pursue a conviction under the act, the work's done for them. So the utterances are not made and they can't be counted. Isn't this really one of the big sort of foundational problems with putting too many bars on hate speech?
Yes. So if you think about the original version of the hate speech bill, which floated around in 2016, which was bordering on lunacy and highly totalitarian, it has been watered down since. You had many cheers from journalists saying, this is wonderful, just arrest all the racists and, this will end racism. Until they started realizing the implications of the law. One of the things that you couldn't do was make fun of people. And they thought, oh, hold on a second, maybe Zapiro's going to go to jail. Maybe some of our satirical columns will be read the wrong way. Maybe those who are incredibly powerful will use it to silence us or jail us. You think about someone like Karen Moore, who has faced criminal prosecution for her reporting on Zuma. You can imagine how a hate speech act can be used to silence her and many others. There is I think, an incapacity among elites to think about the ramifications of the rules that they pass. Now, the ANC said, we are going to rule until Jesus comes back. Turns out that in this election, they only got 40%. So now you've passed a rule which could be used against you. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa, days before the election results, was singing, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. Now, there are many, many people who know what that call means, which is the call for the eradication of Israel and for the Israelis who live inside it. Now, it might be that Cyril Ramaphosa won't be able to control the NPA and may very well face prosecution, as may someone like Nadi Pandor, who will no longer be the International Affairs Minister, given that she didn't take up a seat unless Cyril pulls her back. He only gets 2 people outside of Parliament to bring into to his cabinet. She may very well face prosecution. So I've been saying for years that when parliamentarians craft a law, they are crafting a weapon, and their opponents may be able to reach across the aisle, pick it up, and bludgeon them to death with it. And that future may be sooner than the ANC had realized.
I mean, perhaps the prime example is the rather draconian hate speech legislation that the Scots enacted. And everyone, waiting for the police who sort of undertaken to investigate everything. And the first thing they got were thousands of complaints against the Prime Minister, who was responsible for putting that act forward and having it passed, for saying arguably racially charged things about white people. So you saw an immediate blowback, and it effectively has been used against them. And I don't know whether it will have sort of the desired effect of ultimately having the law changed or repealed, but it's certainly, as you say, the unintended consequences for the elites.
There's a further unintended consequences, which that you can make a martyr out of people as well, and give succor to their sinister cause. So there is a woman in her 90s who has been sent to jail for denying the Holocaust. Now, I think denying the Holocaust is a pretty reprehensible thing to do, and a dangerous thing to say. But when you have a 90-year-old lady in a wheelchair being sent to a prison cell, a lot of people say, well, this seems on its face unfair, and we don't like that. And then it sort of gives room to for people to say, well, she's speaking the truth. And we align ourselves with not just, free speech, but the contents of what she said. And so there is a danger that you can amplify some of the dangerous speech by having these jail sentences that can lead to martyrhood.
Yeah, and particularly, I mean, we've seen it writ large with the Israel-Hamas conflict, and that is that with the protests and with the outrage, and frankly with the anti-Semitism, the conspiracy theories are not only coming out of sort of Islamist from the Islamist side or from the left, but the right has been sort of wading in every now and again as well, because the far right does rather love a good conspiracy theory. And so she would be very much that sort of totem. Mark, thank you very much for being with us. And I'm sure we'll have you back sooner rather than later.
Absolute pleasure.